Good morning on this Martin Luther King Day. What do you know, right? You ain't no Martin Luther King Day. All right. Today we're going to talk about genes, culture, and ginger, basically nature versus nurture, right? And so we're going to start up with the nature side, we'll flip to the nurture side, and then we'll take one of the consequences of nature versus nurture, and that is, what does gender mean? Okay? So, how are humans influenced by nature versus nurture? Yeah, it doesn't really say anything, but we know the evolutionary perspective in psychology emphasizes the fundamental nature of all human beings. In fact, a couple of years back, probably 6 years at this point, maybe even 8, I don't know. I got to hear this guy speak. His name was the Reverend Michael Dowd, and he has a ministry, and he travels around the country, and he preaches a ministry called "Thank God for Evolution." Now, it sounds counterintuitive to be like, "Thank God for evolution." What the heck is that? Well, here's the basic premise that he comes up with. Human beings share like 99% of their genetic material, something like that. 1% difference. I don't know the exact number. But the point is, all over the world, human beings, when they interact with each other, they focus on that 1%. You know, um, I'm this group, you're that group. You know, I'm this, you're that. I'm this religion, you're that religion. I mean, just these tiny little surface differences. Underneath, we're 99% the same. So says the Reverend Michael Dowd. If we just focused on that 99% we have in common instead of always laser going straight to the 1% that's different, we'd be on common ground already, right? So almost all human conflict would disappear if we could just start with that 99%. So evolution is the idea that animals, organisms change with time. They evolve. To evolve means to change, right? And so evolutionary thinking definitely occurred for a long time before Charles Darwin's conception of it. Jean Lamarck had a very interesting idea of evolution that animals in the course of their lifetime would do things that would modify their bodies, and then when they modified their bodies, their offspring would inherit the characteristics. So inheritance of acquired characteristics, right? And so in his silly example over on the top left, you've got the giraffes, and short-necked giraffe is hungry, so he has to stretch its neck very, very, very far to reach those leaves. And the act of stretching the neck turns it into a long neck, and now the babies have longer necks, right? It's silly, but time has come back on this, and we'll talk just briefly on epigenetics at the very end of this somewhere in this presentation. And so Jean Lamarck has been made fun of for years, but he was probably on to something. you know, there was definitely some facts that were out there before Darwin. Okay, and in fact, I guess I want to take another second to step aside. Um, yeah, I know evolution comes out of the biology, but it is applicable to social behaviors as well. Because you could say if a particular biological characteristic in an organism, like the tail of a monkey, a monkey's tail allows it to balance better up in a tree or something, and so monkeys with tails were more likely to be able to survive than monkeys without tails, something like that. But you could talk about social behaviors as well, because animals that exhibit certain behaviors, especially certain things like parenting behaviors, right? These behaviors, which are naturally inborn in us at this point, they're the product of a long chain of evolutionary selection. Those organisms that did not exhibit parental care were less likely to have their offspring reproduce and less likely to have them. So clearly the behaviors and physical characteristics are subject to evolutionary selection. Okay? So, before Darwin, Thomas Malthus had found, he had talked about the Malthusian trap. The idea that, as you can see in that little tiny image, that food supply tends to rise on that straight line, okay? But populations of organisms tend to grow in a much more exponential fashion. And so you see what happens as long as the population line remains under the food line, everybody's happy. But what's going to happen as soon as the population line crosses the food line, there's going to be death. And so what this basically sets up is somebody's going to die. And so that's one of the premises of evolution. Organisms die, right? And so what happens is there's some variability in all population of organisms. You know, some are taller, some are shorter, some are faster, some are slower. I mean, all kinds of things. And what happens also before Darwin is offspring tend to look like their parents. Now, this is something that Darwin and nobody knew why. They just knew it was true, okay? Babies tend to look like mom and dad. And so what made Charles Darwin so famous was the proposal of natural selection. Now, Darwin actually talked about many other mechanisms of evolutionary selection, but natural selection is the big one. And so what happens is somebody's going to die, and remember there was some variability. And so what happens is nature selects. That's why it's called natural selection. Nature selects who lives and dies, right? And so we find that in some environments, the taller giraffe, in some environments, a taller giraffe is able to reach more leaves and get more food and survive. But in a different environment, say for example, where the primary food source is grass, then all of a sudden the long-necked giraffe is less likely to survive because, broken necks, something like that. So clearly what happens is nature selects who dies, and the ones that survive, or the ones that are selected, depends on the environment. Okay, and so sometimes people have this mistaken belief that evolution moves in one direction only, and it doesn't. It can go up, it can go down, it can go back, and go right. Whatever the current environment is what will be selected for. So it's not always the fastest animal that's going to, be selected for, because fast animals burn more calories and need more food. So there might be some advantages of running faster in one environment, and there might be some advantages of having a slow metabolism in another. Who knows? Okay, and so we find that evolution, as a definition, is a change in the traits of a population of organisms from one generation to the next. Evolution has led to evolutionary psychology. Okay, the study of the evolution of behavior using the principles of natural selection. But again, there's artificial selection, there's sexual selection, there's all kinds of other mechanisms of evolutionary change. Well, the study of the evolution of behavior using the principles, which presumably favors genes that predispose behavior tendencies and information processing systems that solved problems faced by our ancestors. What evolutionary psychology has as its core is this understanding that, human beings in 10,000, let's say 10,000 years ago, human beings were living in basically hunter-gatherer groups. They were, living in size 25, less than 25. They were just, they had nothing like we've got. And so now, today, we've got this culture that is just miles, rockets apart, But we got the same brain. Okay, and so we're trying to solve the problems of the 21st century using a brain that evolved to solve the problems of 10,000 years ago. And so there's a fundamental mismatch, okay, and this forms the basis of mismatch theory. And so we're going to find that many human social behaviors just don't match the current environment, but they were great 10,000 years ago, right? It was exactly what you needed for 10,000 years ago. So powerful. So all humans share a common genetic heritage. Yeah. In fact, in the DNA, there's a portion of the DNA called mitochondrial DNA. Most of the DNA that you have is kind of a mix, mom, dad, throw them together in a blender, right? It's a little more sophisticated, but you know what I mean. Mitochondrial DNA, on the other hand, comes directly from your mother. Okay, and therefore, it's your mitochondrial DNA should be exactly the same as your mother's, which should be exactly the same as her mother's, and her mother's, and her mother's, and her mother's, right? But this mitochondrial DNA does, in fact, have tiny bits of mutations when it transfers from mom to you. Okay, so you and your mother won't have exactly the same mitochondrial DNA, but man, it'll be close. You and your mom's mom will be a little less close, but still awfully close. And so what can happen is you can look at the mitochondrial DNA of any two human beings and trace back and based on the fact this rate of mutation is relatively stable, you can get a pretty good estimation of when the most common ancestor occurred between any two human beings on the planet. And it's not that long ago. I mean, we share almost all genetics in common. In fact, with genetic diversity, look at this. You've got group A on the left and group B on the right. And so within each group, you've got variability, okay? By the way, phenotype is just a fancy term for what you look like on the surface, right? You've got a genetic inside and a phenotype is a genotype on the inside, a phenotype on the outside, how it's expressed and looks. So anyway, you've got two groups, and there's a lot of variability between these two, within each group. But take a look at the difference between the averages, and it's relatively small. And yeah, that's how it works between racial groups or ethnic groups or different countries, is within that group there will be a fairly large amount of diversity. But when you look at the difference between the groups and the averages, it's quite small. Okay, and so we find people in group B that are, look more like group A, right? So clearly this is the idea. We've seen this one, but it's again another reminder that, we're all the same, all right? In fact, I didn't have the last time this came up. Check out these babies' faces, all right? The ones on the top, they're universally recognizable, but it's kind of a cheat because they're posed, right? The ones on the bottom, those you can't ask those kids to pose, right? They just make those pictures, those faces. So very cool. All around the world, there's common patterns. Men prefer young women. Women prefer men with resources. Okay, that's universal. It comes from evolution. Okay, women prefer men that are able to provide the resources to care for the offspring. Men prefer women that are young and able to have lots of babies. Now, this is Evolution 101. And lo and behold, I just put a link in here. I hope it's still a good link when you get here. Tinder and Evolutionary Psychology. So the dating app Tinder, and they look at dating profiles and stuff, and it's just the behavior of human beings in these dating apps just pops right on to evolutionary psych. In fact, I've seen a different study at someplace. I don't remember. I was trying to find it this morning when I found this one, but and it was the profiles that men put onto dating apps emphasize their success in their career and their resources, and women's profiles tend to present their looks and their beauty and stuff like this. So even today, whether we know it or not, we're still projecting these evolutionary things. Okay. As another example of a cultural universal, all human language consists of phonemes. Phonemes are the smallest unit of sound. Things like this. There's like 125 of them, something like that, around the world, and no language uses all of them. None. Right? And so there's amazing, because once you become an adult, let's say in the Hindi language, there's two T sounds, t and t, something like that, right? And so you take a look at the far left. If you ask, Hindi-speaking adults, can you tell the difference between t and t? And the Hindi-speaking adults, all of them say yes. English-speaking adults, very, very few of them are able to distinguish between these two sounds. But if you take a look, infants in an English-speaking home that are 6 months old can tell the difference pretty darn well. Okay? In other words, they were born. Human beings are born with the capability of every language in the world. Okay? Even though there are differences that emerge with age, we start with the same. I like that. Okay? Noam Chomsky, in fact, has this notion that human language is a universal. That and there's something to it. I mean, we have linguistic centers in our brain that are active. But he says, and I don't know enough about linguistics here, so I'll just say, look, the semantic, syntactic, and phonological innateness, I have no idea what that means. It sounds good. But the idea is that there are certain features of language that just don't have to be learned, because children already have this stuff burned into them, almost like a reflex, right? But burned in, waiting. Now the only question is exactly which language will be put into it. And so, as another very interesting idea, that in here again, I'm not a linguist, but I'll do my best. Okay, if you make a declarative statement, I went to the store. I is what? The subject. Went is a verb. Store is the object. I guess we're subject, verb, object. I'm just thinking. And so what happens is that would mean there would be 6 combinations possible. Okay. And lo and behold, in the world, 2 of those combinations. See, it's never. There is no language in the world that puts the object first. Okay. Store went I, except maybe Yoda, right? And so nobody in the world, no language. That doesn't even make sense. I mean, with this many languages in the world, if this was, and so all of a sudden, and even verb, object, subject is almost unheard of. So out of the 6 possible combinations, it's like human beings are, they have the structure that allows for the learning of some things but not other things. So clearly, object, verb, subject just doesn't work in a human brain. All right, it can't, or it would have emerged. Oh, I like this one. This one I pulled straight out of my cultural psych class. So they went to 30 different cultures and they asked people like 500 adjectives, and they said, is this a male word or a female word? Okay. And so, this kind of a thing. And then they went, and they had basically, if 75% of people assigned it male or female, then it was called male or female. And then if 75% of cultures agreed, so you have to have 75% agreement in a culture and then 75% across a 25, 30 cultures. They went to all kinds of cultures. And what they found is universal differences. Men are adventurous, dominant, wise, ambitious, assertive, realistic, etc. Okay? And so this was an assignment that was given by, and so we're going to come back to the gender thing, but it's sometimes politically correct to say that boys and girls can do exactly the same things and they're all the same, and it's like they're not the same. I'm sorry, boys and girls are not the same. Women are sentimental, submissive, emotional, fearful, charming, talkative, curious. Okay, so around the world, all right. These are stereotypes, but yet are they real? Okay, if you have a stereotype that emerges across every culture in the world, maybe it's not a stereotype. Maybe it's a truth. I don't know. There's something to it. In fact, there's also a little bit of universality, perhaps. I don't know. This is controversial. But people such as C.S. Lewis believe that there's a common moral standard that all humans adhere to. It's like universal morality, but what happens is all human beings on the planet Earth share a common sense of morality. We all share. However, can choose to ignore this law. It's our choice. I mean, that's kind of what free will is all about. And so it's kind of a strange thought that all human beings would share this common. In fact, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he refers to the deep magic that everybody knows. And so even in his children's literature, he refers to this idea. It's kind of fascinating, intriguing. But in addition to genes, our behavior is also influenced by hormones, chemicals, drugs, and things of this nature. And we'll call that biology, sort of, right? Kind of. But these are nature side influences. Okay, in the next presentation, I'll come back and talk about nurture side influences and kind of talk about the interaction between the two, okay?